All right, let's dive right in. Today we're taking on, I think, a pretty big idea in philosophy, rigid designators.
Yeah.
And I think that, folks who have thought about
That's right.
what has to be true
No.
versus what just so happens to be true,
Yeah.
or how language kind of hooks onto the world.
Right.
Those folks have probably come across this
For sure.
this term or this idea before.
Absolutely.
But I think it's kind of,
It's a dense one.
yeah, it can be a little bit dense. So we're going to try to
Unpack it a bit.
unpack this and shed some light on this
Yeah.
crucial piece of the philosophical machinery.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to put it. I mean, it really is it's a tool that you can use in all sorts of different philosophical discussions. We're going to obviously talk about the core of it, like what it means for a term to be a rigid designator.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're going to go through a bunch of the really amazing implications of this seemingly, technical semantic note actually has all these consequences for metaphysics and epistemology.
Yeah, I mean, what has to be the case? What could be the case?
Right.
What we know versus what we could have known.
Exactly.
So there's a lot.
Lots to discuss here.
Yeah, lots to unpack.
Yeah.
And of course we should.
You mentioned Kripke.
Kripke, right?
Kripke is kind of the person most associated with this idea.
Yeah, he kind of brought it into focus.
Yeah.
But just a little nod to the history of philosophy here. We're going to be primarily focused on Kripke.
Yeah.
But
the idea did not come out of nowhere for Kripke's head.
Yeah. Yeah. So there were folks who were thinking in similar directions before.
Yeah, like Ruth Barkin Marcus.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, it's a long lineage.
Yeah.
And we're going to, give Kripke his due.
Mm-hmm.
But we should also acknowledge that there were people who were working on similar things before.
Yeah. Yeah. So before we even get to those folks,
sure,
I think the real core question here is, what does it even mean for a term to latch on?
To pick out the same object.
The same object in all of these hypothetical...
possible worlds.
Yeah, possible worlds or possible scenarios.
Right.
And I think the even more interesting question, or the more relevant question for us as philosophers is, why does this matter?
Right. Why does this matter? Why should we even care about this question?
So how about we start right at the very beginning?
Sure.
What is a rigid designator?
Yeah. So, like we were just talking about, a rigid designator is a term that designates the same object in all possible worlds in which that object exists.
Mm-hmm.
And it never designates anything else.
So it picks out the same thing no matter
what.
Yeah.
In every possible world where that thing exists.
Okay.
So, for example, the name Saul Kripke designates Saul Kripke in every possible world where Saul Kripke exists.
Okay.
Now, you might think, well, that's sort of obvious.
Right. Well, it's just a name.
It's just a name.
Right.
But it turns out that not all terms work that way.
Okay.
So, and this is where this idea of necessity and contingency comes in. So, in philosophy, we often distinguish between those things that are necessarily true.
Okay.
Those things that could not have been false.
Okay.
And those things that are contingently true. Those things that are
just so
happen to be true.
But
could have been false.
Right.
So, for example, the fact that I am wearing a blue shirt today.
Okay.
That's contingently true.
Right.
I could have worn a red shirt. I could have worn a green shirt.
Or no shirt.
Yeah, exactly.
Nah.
But the fact that 2 + 2 = 4, it seems like it's necessarily true.
Yeah.
It couldn't have been the case that 2 + 2 = 5.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting about rigid designators is that they can help us to determine whether a statement is necessarily true or contingently true.
All right. Can you give us an example of
so let's take Kripke's famous example of Hesperus and Phosphorus.
Yeah.
So, back in the day, astronomers noticed that there was a really bright star in the evening sky.
Okay. And they named it Hesperus.
Right. And then they noticed that there was a really bright star in the morning sky.
Oh.
And they named that Phosphorus.
Okay, so two different names.
Two different names, right?
Yeah.
And then at some point,
They figured out it was the same star.
They figured out it was the same planet, actually.
Oh,
Venus, right.
Okay, Venus.
So Hesperus is Venus,
right.
and Phosphorus is Venus.
Right.
Now, what Kripke says
Yeah.
is that the names Hesperuses and Phosphoruses
Yeah.
are rigid designators.
Yeah.
They pick out Venus
Okay.
in every possible world
Okay.
where Venus exists.
Okay.
So the statement, Hesperus is phosphorus, is necessarily true
Okay.
if it's true at all.
Okay. Okay, I see.
Because in every possible world where Venus exists, Hesperus picks out Venus,
Right.
and phosphorus picks out Venus.
Right.
So they must be the same thing.
Now, why is that surprising?
Well, it's surprising.
Or why is it that philosophically interesting?
Yeah, philosophically interesting because it seems like we discovered that Hesperus was phosphorus.
Empirically.
Empirically, right.
Through observation.
We had to look at the sky
Yeah.
and figure it out. It wasn't something that we could just
Yeah, like figure out from our armchair.
figure out from our armchairs.
Okay.
So, traditionally,
Yeah.
philosophers thought that necessary truths
Yeah.
were all a priori.
Oh, okay.
So
Knowable by reason alone.
a priori
Yeah.
kind of means
Without,
experience.
yeah, independent of experience.
Yeah. Okay.
So, think about like mathematical truth.
Right.
2 + 2 = 4.
Yeah.
You don't have to go out and like
Look at apples and oranges.
count apples and oranges to
Right.
figure that out.
Yeah.
But this case of Hesperus and Phosphorus seems to be different.
Right.
It seems like we discovered a necessary truth
Right.
through empirical means.
Yeah.
And so
It's a necessary but a posteriori.
it's a necessary a posteriori truth.
Right.
And that was a big deal.
Yeah. Why was that such a big deal?
Well, because
With the philosophers.
it challenged this traditional picture of the relationship between...
Necessity
Yeah.
and a priority.
Okay.
So,
so like Kant thought.
yeah, all the necessary truths are a priori.
And all the a priori truths are necessary.
Right.
But this seems to show
So there's
at least one case
where that's not true.
that's not the case.
Okay.
So it's a really significant example for that reason.
Now, how does this contrast with using a non-rigid designator?
Okay, so
It's like, is there an example of that?
so let's take the description.
Okay.
The brightest non-lunar object in the evening sky.
Okay.
Now, in our world,
Okay.
that description picks out Venus.
Okay.
So the statement, Hesperus is the brightest non-lunar object in the evening sky, is true,
Right.
but it's not necessarily true.
Okay, why not?
Because we can imagine a possible world
Okay.
where Venus is not the brightest non-lunar object in the evening sky.
Okay.
Maybe,
I mean, Mars is close.
maybe Mars is closer, or
Yeah.
maybe there's a supernova or
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
So in that possible world, the description, the brightest non-lunar object in the evening sky, would pick out something else.
Okay.
It wouldn't pick out Venus.
So it would pick out Mars.
Or it'd pick out Mars or the supernova, whatever.
Right.
So the statement, Hesperus is the brightest non-lunar object in the evening sky,
Yeah.
is only contingently true.
Right.
Because it's true in our world.
Yeah, it depends on.
But it could have been false.
Right.
So the key difference
Yeah.
is that the name Hesperus
Yeah.
is rigid.
It sticks to
It sticks to Venus.
to Venus.
No matter what.
Right.
Whereas the description,
Yeah.
the brightest non-lunar object in the evening sky,
Yeah.
is non-rigid.
It could pick out different things.
It could pick out different things in different possible worlds.
Okay.
And that's why.
So that's the crucial difference.
That's the crucial difference.
Yeah.
Between a rigid designator
Yeah.
and a non-rigid designator.
Yeah. Now, we've been talking about Kripke.
Right.
Yeah. Did he offer any sort of like clarifications?
Yeah, so he offered a bunch of clarifications.
Yep.
Um,
What were some of those?
One important one
Okay.
is that when we talk about a term being rigid,
Yeah.
we're talking about
Yeah.
how we use it
Okay.
with its meaning fixed in the actual world.
Okay.
So it's not that
Yeah.
the term itself has some kind of magical property
Right.
of rigidity.
Yeah.
It's that you're using it in a certain way.
Right. So we're using it
And with that way of using it,
with a meaning that's fixed.
with that meaning fixed,
Yeah.
it designates the same object
Mhm.
across all possible worlds,
Okay.
regardless of
Yeah.
what other names or descriptions.
Right. So even if someone in another possible world called Venus Gerald
Exactly.
our use of...
Our use of Hesperus
Yeah.
would still pick out Venus in
Right.
that world.
Right. Okay.
So that's an important...
That's a helpful clarification.
It's a helpful clarification.
Yeah.
Another clarification
Yeah.
is that
Yeah.
while the statement
Yeah.
Hesperus is the brightest non-lunar object in the evening sky
Right.
is contingent,
Yeah.
the statement
Yeah.
Venus is identical with Hesperus
Okay.
is necessarily true.
Okay, so Venus.
And that's because
Right.
Venus and Hesperus
Right.
are both rigid designators
Right.
for the same object.
Okay.
So it's just a matter of self-identity.
Yeah, it's the same.
It's the same thing as saying Venus is Venus.
Right. Right.
Which is obviously
Which has to be true.
necessarily true.
Yeah.
And then a
Yeah.
third clarification has to do with
Yeah.
what happens when a rigid designator
Yeah.
is used to refer to something
Yeah.
that doesn't exist in a possible world.
Oh, okay. So like,
So, for example, we can imagine a possible world
yeah.
where Shakespeare
Right.
never existed.
You ever wrote Hamlet?
Never wrote Hamlet yet.
Yeah.
So what happens to the name Shakespeare
Right.
in that possible world?
Does it just not refer to anything?
Well, there are two views.
Okay.
One view is that it just doesn't designate anything,
Okay.
so it's just kind of an empty name.
An empty name. Okay.
The other view,
Yeah.
sometimes called obstinate rigidity,
Obstinate rigidity.
is that the name Shakespeare
Yeah.
still tries to refer to
Eh?
Shakespeare,
Even though he doesn't exist.
even though he doesn't exist,
Okay.
but it fails.
So it's trying, but it can't.
It's trying, but it can't.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting.
It's a bit of a subtle point,
Yeah.
but Kripke didn't really
Take a stance on that.
take a definitive stance on that.
Okay.
He thought
Yeah.
that maybe the important philosophical points
Okay.
didn't really depend on
Okay.
which of those views you took.
Yeah. Now, he also mentioned this idea of weak necessity.
Yeah.
What was that about?
So weak necessity is basically the idea that
Yeah.
an identity statement like Hesperus is phosphorus
Okay.
is true in all possible worlds
Okay.
where both Hesperus and phosphorus exist.
Okay, so it's weak. So it's not true.
Because it's limited to those.
It's limited to those
worlds.
to those worlds.
Okay.
So it's not like a super strong form of necessity
Right.
that holds in absolutely all possible worlds,
Okay.
but it's still strong enough to capture the idea
Right. Yeah.
that Hesperus and phosphorus are necessarily
The same thing.
the same thing,
Yeah.
if they exist at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's
So it's kind of like it's a limited
a limited form of necessity.
great form of necessity,
Yeah.
but it's still interesting.
It's still philosophically interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So now up to this point, we've mainly been talking about proper names.
Right. Yeah.
Does this concept of rigidity apply to...
So it's most straightforwardly applied to proper names.
Okay. Of objects?
Of concrete objects, yeah.
Yeah.
But it can
Yeah.
be extended to
Yeah.
other grammatical categories as well.
All right. So like what?
So, for example, indexicals.
Indexicals. Okay. So what are...
Right. Like I and toe.
Oh,
you know, these terms seem to pick out different things
Yeah.
in different possible worlds.
Okay. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I refers to me
Right.
in this world,
It refers to someone else.
but it might refer to someone else in another possible world.
in another possible world.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's a question about whether
Your indexicals can be
indexicals can be rigid.
rigid.
And it sort of depends on
Yeah.
how you think about
Yeah.
how they work.
Yeah.
So one view is that
Yeah.
indexicals are just disguised descriptions.
Okay.
So I really means the person who is speaking
Right.
or the person who is uttering this sentence.
Okay.
And if that's the case,
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
it's not rigid
Right. Because that could be someone else
because that could be someone else in another possible world.
in another possible world. Yeah.
But another view is that
Yeah.
indexicals are directly referring.
Okay.
So they just pick out the
Yeah.
object or the person
Yeah.
without any intermediary description.
Right.
And if that's the case,
Yeah.
then they might be rigid
Okay.
because they're just,
So it's like they're latched onto.
yeah, they're just latched onto
Yeah. And that thing.
that person or that object.
Right.
So, for example,
Yeah.
if I say to you,
Yeah.
you made good time,
Okay.
you there
Yeah.
seems to be directly referring to you.
Right.
And it seems like it would pick you out,
Yeah.
even in a possible world
Right.
where you didn't make good time.
Right. Because it's still...
Right, because it's still talking about you.
Yeah, it's talking about
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Sure.
indexicals are kind of tricky.
Yeah, there's some debate about whether
Yeah.
they can be rigid.
Yeah.
What about
What about demonstratives?
Demonstratives, yeah.
Yeah.
So like that.
Yeah.
So
is that...
yeah, that's rigid.
Yeah.
So again, it sort of depends on
Yeah.
your theory of demonstratives.
Right.
If you think that
Yeah.
that just picks out
Yeah.
whatever happens to be
Yeah.
salient
Yeah.
or prominent
Right.
in the context,
Yeah.
then it's not going to be rigid
Right.
because that thing might be different
Yeah. It could be a different...
in different possible worlds.
Being a different world.
Yeah.
Okay.
But if you think that that somehow directly refers
Right.
to a particular object,
Yeah.
then it might be rigid.
Okay.
And then what about definite descriptions?
Definite descriptions, yeah.
We already talked a little bit about those.
So most definite descriptions
Yeah.
are non-rigid.
Okay.
So, for example,
Yeah.
the President of the United States.
All right. It's going to be
because it picks out a different person.
Yeah.
In different possible worlds.
Yeah. Okay.
But
But there are some exceptions.
there are some exceptions.
Right.
So Kripke talks about
Yeah.
de facto rigid descriptions.
Okay.
So these are descriptions that are rigid,
Okay.
not because of their meaning,
Okay.
but because of metaphysical facts.
Oh, okay.
So, for example, the
Yeah.
successor of 2
Right.
is a de facto rigid description.
Right.
It picks out 3 in
Yeah.
every possible world.
Because 3 is
Plus
necessarily
3 is necessarily the successor of 2.
Yeah.
It's just a...
it's built into the constant metaphysical fact.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Okay.
that's
So that's kind of an interesting...
yeah. It's a kind of special case.
Yeah.
And
What about natural kind terms?
natural kind terms? Yeah.
Yeah.
So these are terms like
Yeah.
water, gold,
Yes.
tiger.
Yeah. Are those rigid?
And these are widely considered to be rigid designators.
Okay.
So
What do they rigidly designate?
yeah. So what do they rigidly designate?
Because they don't...
That's a good question.
They don't designate like a particular...
Right, because they don't designate a concrete particular,
Right. Like
Saul Kripke does.
Yeah, Saul Kripke.
Right.
So
the view
yeah.
is that they designate
Yeah.
kinds.
Kinds.
So, for example, water
Yeah.
designates the kind water
Okay.
in every possible world.
Okay.
Now, what's interesting
Yeah.
is that this kind of commits you to
Okay.
a view about
Yeah.
the nature of kinds.
Right.
So it suggests that kinds are
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
that exist
Yeah.
independently
Yeah.
of the particular objects
Right.
that instantiate them.
Right.
So there's like
So there's like a kind of
kind of water that exists
Yeah.
even if there's no actual water
Okay, that's interesting.
in a possible world.
Yeah. Are there other
Yeah.
categories of language that might be rigid?
We've talked about proper names.
Yeah.
We've talked about indexicals,
Yeah.
demonstratives,
Yeah.
definite description,
Yeah.
natural kind terms.
Yeah.
Um,
What about like
so general terms
Yeah.
like tiger red.
tiger
okay.
red?
Those rigid?
So those are often recognized as rigid as well.
Okay. And
Yeah.
so that
Yeah.
raises kind of a different
Raises a different...
set of complications
Yeah.
than singular terms.
Okay, how so?
Well, because they don't designate
Yeah.
particular objects.
Right. They designate...
They designate properties or relations or something like that.
Yeah.
And so there's a question about what
Yeah.
it means
Yeah.
for a term to
Yeah.
be rigid
Yeah.
when it designates a property
Yeah.
or a relation.
Yeah.
And there are a bunch of different views about that,
Okay.
but we won't go into all of those details here.
Okay.
But
But suffice it to say...
it's a complicated issue.
Okay, so it's not as...
It's not as straightforward
straightforward.
as with
with proper names.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And then very briefly,
Yeah.
I'll just mention that
Yeah.
there's also been some discussion about whether
Yeah.
verbs,
Okay, verb is
adverbs
bad.
can be rigid.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
For example, you might think